How do we paint an accurate picture of our energy future at a time of so much change? The cost curves for varying generation technologies have changed rapidly over the last 10 years. Geopolitics is affecting global energy markets in ways that we're kind of unfamiliar with over the last few decades, but having to realize anew the importance of energy security and politics and how we design the global energy system. I'm Joseph Majkut. I'm the director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS, and my guest today is one of the world's top experts in thinking through how do we get, if not an accurate, a useful picture of what the future of the energy system might look like. Eirik Wærness is a vice president and chief economist at Equinor and the lead author of Equinor's Energy Perspectives, the new version of which was published here in 2023. Eirik, welcome to CSIS.
Thanks for having me here. It's great to be back.
You know, when you think about all the changes we've seen over the last few years, and with this new energy perspective, how have you tried to incorporate the return of geopolitics to global energy markets, and what does that mean for the different scenarios that you and your team put together?
Well, some years back, we used to have a scenario which was not the central scenario, where we used geopolitical drivers and variables as one of the key distinguishing factors that could drive the world in a different development than the one we believed the most in. Mm-hmm. And that scenario was called rivalry.
Right.
Over the last years, with the geopolitical changes that we've seen, the invasion of Ukraine last year, the increasingly tight and difficult tensions between the West and China, the United States and China, Europe and China, we have moved those geopolitical drivers into the central case in what the scenario we believe the most in. Yeah. And we've made the name of that scenario reflect on some of the things that we see. We call it walls, to illustrate a world where we build walls between us, we do not cooperate, we introduce sanctions, we have limits on our technology exchange, we focus on other things than solving globally common collective problems in a collectively smart manner. So that's how we have incorporated it. And then of course it's about the details and how do you model it and all that. But it is here, it's around us, and we think it will have an impact on the future of energy.
So help me understand the long-term view, right? So you've got sort of two scenarios. One, the world gets a little more fractured, a little more protectionist, a little more isolationist. Another where there's a concerted effort to share clean energy technologies, move finance around in a sort of optimal way. Like what sort of, in your view, what is the near-term and the long-term outlook in terms of climate outcomes?
Well, in the near term, not a lot is going to happen. We think for the next 2, 3, 4 years, we will not see different scenarios playing out that will make a large difference either on energy outcomes or CO2 emission trajectories from the energy sector. The system is too large, it takes too long to change anyway. Yeah. And what we see in the near term is a flattening of global energy-related CO2 emissions. That's driven by oil and gas demand continue to grow a bit, coal demand flattening out and declining. We see then emissions in the emerging economies, except China, growing. Exactly compensated by the decline in CO2 emissions in the industrialized world, and then with China being the one that determines that these CO2 emissions will be flat, because we think CO2 emissions in China will be relatively flat. So that's very far away from what's needed in terms of addressing climate change targets, because then we need a relatively rapid start of a decline that then becomes massive. We don't see that the next 3, 4, 5 years. The world will still be focusing on energy security, on the geopolitical conflicts, handling that. Right. But at the same time, we see massive positive changes both in policy, and we see some parts of the technology development being very positive, both in EV penetration, for instance, and also on the renewable side, in particular for solar. So those are building up. Yeah. And then long term, starting in 2026, 27, you can imagine different scenarios where we have what we think is the most likely. Our forecasting scenarios that we call walls will be, it's energy and climate policies driven by IRA, as one example, is in that scenario with an impact, not as large an impact as the most positive forecast would indicate, but still significant. the European New Industrial Plan, the Green Deal, to follow up on that. We see tightening climate policies in countries that introduce carbon prices, et cetera, et cetera. Continued technology development, but within a context of continued geopolitical tension, if you like. That scenario does not deliver on the climate targets. It's a massive change. It's a significant increase in the pace of the energy transition.
Yeah.
But then we have another scenario on what would it take to stay within the 1.5 degree carbon budget. We call that bridges, as opposed to walls. Bridges are open-ended, allow us to cooperate. And we only think that can take place in a world that is geopolitically very benign and where we cooperate. And that would lead to massive CO2, and it would have to lead to massive CO2 reductions from 2025, 6, 7 and onwards towards 2050. We think to stay within the budget of 1.5 degree warming, we'll have to go net negative in terms of global emissions by 2045. So taking more CO2 out of the atmosphere than we put in.
Let me pause here for a moment. You know, when I started my career in climate and energy, we regularly talked about warming at the end of the 21st century of 3, 4, 5 degrees centigrade. Yeah. And I'm hearing from you, and we've heard it from peers who also do forecasts, that sort of business as usual looks like a 2 to 3 degree centigrade world. Yeah. How much of that change, you know, do you feel like is publicly understood? How much of this is a victory of climate or technology policy? And how much of it is a change in the overall global economic outlook?
Well, it's a bit of both. I think, first of all, it's one of the significantly under-communicated developments over the last years, is that in the climate debate, we still talk about the 4 degree warming scenario, what is called RCP 8.5 or something, which is not going to happen. And that is really good news, right? And it's not a business as usual trajectory, but it's a trajectory that looks at what would most likely happen going forward, right? And what are the long-term impacts of energy and climate policy? What are the long-term impacts of technology? And that will most likely bring us to something which is between 2.2, which is what we have in the wall scenario, and 3 degrees of warming, somewhere there. UN says 2.5.
Sure. Yeah.
So, which is really good news, right? But it's completely under-communicated, and we still stick to this danger of a much higher warming in the debate.
Right.
This is both a consequence, to some extent, of something which is not that good, which is slightly lower GDP forecasts, right? I mean, a lower economic growth than what we thought some years back. Slowing down of the economic development in China, the COVID. The long-term impact of that, of course, is that not necessarily that much lower growth rate, but we had a significant shift down in GDP level. Yeah. And therefore we will have a lower GDP going forward. Some of it is faster pickup in technology than we thought, in particular on the EV side maybe, and on solar, which is good news. So it's a bit of both. And then, of course, what we're talking about now is the challenge of bringing the world even further down on the emission trajectory, which is a massive challenge, and has to be driven then by policy and technology development and cooperation.
And that's the bridges world.
And that's the bridges world, right?
And so, I mean, I know. So let's think about bridges both as an analogy and as I'm interested in what's the difference in outcome, right? So, what if you were to kind of give us the eigenvalues in linear algebra speak? What are the most important changes between the sort of wall scenario and the bridges scenario in terms of technologies that get deployed, the sort of the quality of global energy markets, you know, 2 or 3 defining characteristics between the two?
Yeah, the biggest difference, I guess, is the speed at which technology is spreading and how it is spreading all over the world, and not only within the industrialized countries. Right. It is about how do you solve the massive need for energy in emerging economies without increasing the emissions. And it's the level of cooperation that we do this through policy changes that are much more penetrative, if you like, than what we see now in terms of carbon pricing and technology support and regulation. Yeah, it's and it's opening up of the borders, if you like, in terms of global cooperation that makes it so that we also make it possible to do all of these things sufficiently quickly in an efficient manner. So that is, we shouldn't be too concerned about where the minerals come from, but we should be concerned with how we bring them to the market, right, as an example.
Yeah, maybe that's a great place to dive in, actually, because one of the other things that this report does is take a pretty serious look at the minerals side of the energy transition and the differences that we would anticipate between what we expect to see today and a faster or more fervent energy transition. You know, this is where your sort of focus on geopolitics and the energy system become really interesting, because as I read the report, I see very different worlds in terms of minerals need, minerals development, and sort of the new way we're going to have to think about developing that stuff. Maybe you can give us some key lessons from your analysis.
Yeah, no, I think first of all, the energy transition by itself is seen to contribute to less importance of some of the classic geopolitical pinch points or hot spots that we've had. You know, reducing dependence on oil and gas reduces the dependence on some of the key suppliers there.
Right.
On the other hand, the energy transition requires massive growth in rare earth elements, minerals, which have to be mined, processed, and refined.
Right.
And today, those types of sources of resources are much more concentrated than oil and gas ever were.
Right.
They're concentrated by China dominating the supply chains of this to a very large extent, and then we have some of the key minerals are also concentrated in single countries.
In terms of production.
In terms of existence, mining.
Yeah.
The Democratic Republic of Congo as one example, Indonesia on nickel. You have some countries that are important in lithium and so on. So that, and therefore we meet there the same type of issues, both in terms of geopolitical conflict. We have issues like energy efficiency and bringing these to the markets, water shortage, use of resources, human rights, the same type of issues. And in a situation where we need to ramp up the deliveries of these types of minerals 5 to 10 times over the next 15 years to be within these types of results that the Bridges case that illustrates, then that also illustrates the need for global cooperation also in this dimension to make it happen, right?
Totally.
So
so then here's the question, right? Or here's the question I think about. Dan Jurgen has written about the new map. You just gave us a bunch of characteristics that fit onto that new map when we think about transitioning and being more and having an economy that needs to develop these minerals and them not then being related to energy security. Are we acting in a way right now where we're developing those things in a collaborative way or in a cooperative way? Does cooperation have to look like a kumbaya? Hey, we're all agreeing to work on this, or is it really, we're setting the rules for the market to help develop these resources and different alignments and countries to work together in clubs or groups? What does cooperation really mean?
No, I think cooperation here means an openness to finding common solutions that are effective and efficient. And we have a limited set of resources on this earth, both in terms of brain capacity, human beings, and financial capital and stuff. So we need to apply those resources as efficiently as possible to get the most bang for the buck. And that goes both for reducing emissions where it's most effective. It's also bringing these new minerals to the market in the most effective manner, irrespective of who does it and who cooperates and so on. Right? And we're not there now. And also the need for speed here is such that we have to develop new sources of supply chains, new mines, new processing facilities in a speed that requires us to cooperate differently than we are used to. This is investments in countries that are basically uninvestable for Western capitalists. So we have to do that in a different manner as well, and we have to speed it up.
But here, the difference between the two scenarios you've got, that quality sort of is true in both cases, right? It's like electric cars are already going to be a big market player in your baseline scenario. So we need to develop those resources. The difference there seems to be a lot about speed. Is that correct?
Yeah, speed and scale. And if I can illustrate some of the outcomes of our scenarios, because when you listen to 2.2 degree versus 1.5, it doesn't sound that it's much of a difference, right?
I'd love to take the tour.
So let's these are three ways we use energy in the world, three of the energy uses. When we talk about climate change, we very often talk about electrification and transport.
Right.
But that's only two sources of where we use energy, two uses of energy, right? And if you look at these charts here, you see the difference between how much electricity we use to the left and how that is produced today in the left column there, and then you have how much electricity will we use in 2050 in the two scenarios. So the 2.2 wall scenario and a 1.5 degree bridges scenario. So we almost double the use of electricity.
Yep.
And all the new stuff and more will now have to come from renewable sources like solar and wind. Yep. Some more nuclear, quite a bit actually, 50% more nuclear, and also some more hydro hidden in that dark green at the bottom of that column. I mean, you can see that we almost take out coal.
Yeah,
and gas in the electricity sector. The dark here, fossil fuels, is oil, gas, and coal. There's no oil to speak of in the electricity sector. Coal and gas will, by 2050, be taken out in the bridges scenario.
Got it.
Massive changes in the wall scenario as well, but there we still have quite a bit of fossil fuels left in the electricity sector. So there we can see one of the differences between 2.2 and 1.5.
And if I may, I actually I perceive a small bar there that's hydrogen, right?
The little green one there is hydrogen, which has to be, first you have to produce the hydrogen.
Right.
Maybe from electricity, green electricity, turn it into hydrogen in an electrolysis factory, and then put it back burn it as a source of electricity in order to balance the electricity system. It's really inefficient, but we might need to do that since we have so much variable renewables in that system.
But that's an energy security tool.
That's an energy security tool. Then you talked about EVs, road transport. That's EVs, that's just the light-duty vehicles plus trucks. That's basically only oil today. This is where half the global oil goes in. Going forward, in the Walls case, we're going to have more efficient road transport. You mentioned EVs. That's the red one there, electricity. It's going to be a sizable chunk. But look at what we need to go to the 1.5 degree scenario. We basically have to electrify all of road transport. We need fewer cars in that scenario, so people will have to manage their transport needs in a different way. This is behavioral change as well. And we are going to electrify all of trucking as well. We have a little bit of hydrogen at the top there, which is some long-distance trucking. This is one of the massive differences between walls and bridges. How much more does it take? Then you go to the right there, that's the non-road transport. So that's everything that runs on rails or in the air or in the water. That will change. In the Walls case, not that much. All the new transport will basically be using some biofuels, some blue or green ammonia or methanol, and some more electricity in rail. But if you go to bridges, we're going to have much more electricity. That's the public transport that is replacing some of the cars. You have much more ammonia in shipping, and you have much more biofuels in aviation. So we hardly use any oil in non-road transportation in 2050. Massive change relative to the Walls.
Yeah, really.
And now we're done with transport and electricity. We go to the next one, right? Which is we use energy elsewhere too. Energy for manufacturing to produce all the stuff that we buy. That's the industrial demand to the left here. That is already composed of quite a bit of coal, some oil, gas, electricity, and some biomass. In 2050, that sector will be more efficient, so the use of energy grows less than global GDP. It will be more electric, that's the red, grows. But if you go all the way to the bridges case, we have to take out almost all the fossil fuels of this sector as well. The remaining fossil fuels we have there will have to be equipped with carbon capture and storage. But we use also their hydrogen, you can see, for instance, to replace coal in the steel sector, to produce steel. Buildings, 2 billion more people, maybe 1 billion more homes have to be built. They use heating, gas or electricity for heating. They use electricity for lights, their elevators, whatever. So that's the change there. We will have to have more efficient use of energy in homes. They have to be more insulated, or we have to get incentives as consumers to try and save electricity instead of using it when we think it's for free when the solar panel is exposed to sun, right? So if we don't need that electricity, bring it onto the grid so we use less energy. That's the bridges case. So we think we have to use less energy in a housing sector for 2 billion more people than we do today.
Right, and that's principally a story about the emerging economy.
That's where the population growth is. And it's also about taking out, you can see there's a lot of biomass in that sector today. That's basically people burning wood, waste, etc., to heat their homes or to cook their food. That has to go down as well, because that's not sustainable. We need cleaner fuels in large parts of the world. We need reliable energy. We need LPG instead of biomass. We need electricity. And then the last part of the energy use is what's called non-energy demand. That's the oil and gas and coal that goes as feedstock into our petrochemical industry. We will be many more consumers. We'll have much more purchasing power. So we will need more of that.
Right.
And that's where we don't burn the molecule. That's where the hydrocarbon molecule is contained in the product.
Yep.
We will do more plastic, focus more on plastic waste. We will recycle more, but we still need more of that. Mm-hmm. And in that in the Walls case, in the Bridges case, that component of oil demand is a very large part of remaining oil demand. And this is why we do not believe in a future without fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. We still will need a lot of fossil fuels also for the petrochemical industry.
Right.
To produce basically everything we do. And EV contains a lot of copper, a lot of batteries, but it also contains a lot of fossil fuels. Your iPhone could contain 6 liters of oil.
Oh.
That's more than a gallon of oil.
Got denser.
Yeah, you have a small phone, but an iPhone 14. So that is how, and I guess the main point about this exercise is to show that moving from a 2.2 degree world to a 1.5 degree world has massive implications for how the energy composition and the energy demand develops in different sectors, right?
Right.
So an electrification is one key, because that's where you can use energy more efficiently, and you can also have the opportunities to decarbonize it, because we go out of coal and gas and into renewables.
And it, just to take ask your editorial opinion for a moment, if you kind of look at some of the trends we've seen over the last few years, so Europe in response to the loss of Russian gas supply has accelerated the deployment of heat pumps and other electric building services. The U.S. has a big part of the IRA, perhaps underappreciated, is the tax subsidies for electrifying homes and commercial buildings.
Yes.
We're yet to see how well that is working here, but what I hear from European colleagues is that they've really accelerated on the other side of the Atlantic. So where do you kind of, if you were to take a Taylor series, or you were to draw the line on where we are in the curve now, how much do we need to accelerate to increase climate ambition?
Well, we need to accelerate massively.
Okay.
And I think the main difference is when we talk about Europe or North America, what we believe is in the Walls case, in the base scenario, what we think is most likely, European emissions go down by 70% from now to 2050. Yeah. North American emissions, including Mexico and Canada and the US, goes down by 50%. Mm-hmm. And then getting to net zero, which is what we have in the 1.5 degree scenario, is a big chunk, but it's not that big compared to what it is now. The big difference is the emerging economies. How do we handle the growth? And that's where the energy demand is growing. Yep. That's where we have more than 2 billion people without reliable sources of energy. Mm-hmm. That's where the economic growth is the highest. That's where the energy poverty is the highest. Mm-hmm. That's where people actually need energy to survive. Right. And and the big difference between the two scenarios there is how are we able to deliver that type of energy in the Bridges case without increasing emissions as much as otherwise would. So it's about jumping to renewables. Right. It's about providing the technology to have low carbon energy based on gas, for instance, because you need the molecules. There are some sectors that are very hard to electrify. Yep. To allow sufficient time also to build the infrastructure needed for electricity grids, for instance. Mm-hmm. We're going to have massive needs for grids. So that's, and all these things have to come together at the same time within the next 15 years. If we haven't started, then we can forget it, right? Then it will take longer to get the emissions sufficiently down.
So what are the things that, I think that's a really compelling point. And what are the things that what are the things that we build these bridges from, right? So is it, here in the US, the administration argues that the IRA is going to drive down the costs of clean energy technologies that are deployed with these tax subsidies. And that creates a global public good that's shared with the world.
Definitely.
Do we have enough bridges to share that technology with the world? Or likewise the innovation that comes out of Europe or the innovation that comes out of China? And if not, how do we start building them now?
I think first of all, the things that are going on both in the European energy policy and in particular now with the next step globally was when IRA was put into action last year, right? It's really good, and it's absolutely necessary that the richest parts of the world, the ones that have used most of the carbon, will now do what we can to get the costs down of some of these technologies, figure out how you can do it. It's about finding out what to do. Then it's about figuring out how to scale it, because that's when you get the costs down. Yeah. And then it's about deploying it. Right. For the latter part, how do we make these technologies available for the emerging economies? That's a political decision once we're there, and that's not a given. That in a geopolitically very tense world, even if we have the technology available, are we willing to share it with somebody who can't pay for it? Are we willing to share it with somebody we don't like? Because that is necessary in order to make this happen sufficiently quickly, and we haven't seen that yet. But of course, all these changes contains the possibilities and the seeds of what is necessary and what we need to. And that's why we are more optimistic now on some of these things than we were some years back, right? That's why walls is a greener scenario than our previous central case. But going all the way to bridges requires. Once you have a good idea that you've made possible, you figured out that it works, you have sufficiently low cost, then you better bring it to an emerging economy under a under a just energy transition platform or program or partnership,
which is going to involve technology sharing, financing, knowledge, know-how transfer, a whole basket of things.
And at the same time, also being open for the possibility that the 5 billion brains in the emerging economies have good ideas that we can apply and actually pay for as well. You know? I mean, both India and China and Korea and Brazil and South Africa and Nigeria will also come up with a lot of good ideas. So, and they need us to pay for that. So so that is also that's the flip side of that, and we're not ready for that either yet. But that is something we have to do as well.
So let me close in just not in a way that I'm trying to cast a shadow, but I want to get this in before the end of our session. When you look at this, you have kind of two scenarios of energy transition, one fast, one slower. But what keeps you up at night with respect? Both of these are big transitions over the next few decades, right? I think it's safe to say we need oil and natural gas through that period, but potentially a lot less of it. That creates financing challenges and uncertainty. We need a dramatically larger supply chain for clean energy goods. We talked a little bit about minerals. You and I didn't talk about the manufacturing bit of that.
Or processing.
But we know that those are important too. And so, in a model in the computer, these things can kind of be set up so that they sort of perfectly complement each other. Can the world do that?
No, probably not, and not in such a smooth manner as our curves show either. As well. No, and I think the one thing that worries me the most is that we're not sufficiently conscious about the need to continue to provide energy as efficiently as possible while we do this transition. So we have to be able to develop and provide some of the alternatives for consumers to choose differently. But until they can choose differently, we cannot stop them from having affordable, reliable energy with as low a carbon emission as possible. Because that's my worry here, is that we cut off the necessary investments in gas and oil too soon, if you like, or we make it so unpopular to do it that nobody wants to invest in that, while we still haven't developed the alternatives sufficiently fast or sufficiently.
It's a larger question. It's a question for next time, but how we invent policy mechanisms that are going to secure energy throughout this transition, I think is like one of our most interesting challenges for economic and policy thinkers.
It is, definitely.
Well, Eirik, we're at our appointed time. Thank you so much for sharing these lessons with us today. I'm leaving a bit more optimistic about our collective climate future. I feel like I actually have a really good idea now of kind of what do we need to do in the margins to improve that future yet more. And your insights have been really helpful in that regard. So please accept my gratefulness, and I hope that the next time you're here in Washington, we can invite you back to CSIS to solve the rest of the world's problems.
Definitely. Thanks for listening, and thanks for having me here.
All right, Eirik, thank you so much. Colleagues.